Thank you all so much for being here on the last of our summer Mondays. This has been a series of presentations that we've been doing here, loosely based on themes from the archive of the Agency of Unrealized Projects, which is a project by e-flux and Serpentine Gallery that was devised by Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Julia Peyton-Jones, Anton Vidocle, and Julieta Aranda. And a bit more on the AUP. Unlike unrealized architectural projects, which are frequently exhibited and circulated, unrealized artworks tend to remain unnoticed or little known. But perhaps there is another form of artistic agency in the partial expression, the incomplete idea, the projection of a mere intention. The Agency of Unrealized Projects seeks to document and display these works, in this way charting the terrain of a contingent future. So tonight we're here to celebrate the end of summer and to gather around the notion of failure. Thank you to everyone at e-flux who has made this evening and this series possible. Thank you so much to the artists for being here and for all of you. So Magda will now introduce the invited guests and talk a bit more about our evening on failure. Thanks.
Failure, of course. First failure of the night. So our last evening in a series of 5 nights comes to an end. And with tonight's Fail Better, which is kind of like, unfortunately, the last one, curator Natasha Marie Llorens, Nuno da Luz, and Tyler Coburn will talk and present on the notion of failure. They will discuss its nature through unrealized ideas, projects destined to fail, and exhibitions which explore failure. Tonight we'll begin with curator Natasha Marie Llorens and Failing to Levitate. Will be followed by artist Nuno da Luz and a presentation of a diaporama on ZTEDx. And then Tyler Coburn will consider interpassivity as a failure to perform established subjects, types, and how the terms of culture, authorship, and exhibition making may decenter accordingly. Each presentation will take approximately 25 minutes. And of course, as usual, conversation and drinks will follow in the back in the kitchen. So our first presentation by Natasha is an experimental lecture about failing to levitate, a recent project she co-curated with Kerry Downey at the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts project space. From the press release, a line written months ago that describes this talk's intention. Failure here is not an end, it is a space that opens up after an idea or an experience has exhausted itself. After balloons deflate and the smoke clears. In this space, together, we hover, in not knowing and struggling to listen. Natasha is a writer and an independent curator who's based in New York. Her upcoming projects include Prove It to Me at Reverse Gallery in Williamsburg and Frames of War at Momenta in Bushwick. She holds an MA in curatorial practice from Bard and is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History at Columbia University. Her research is focused on violence and representation in the 1970s and 1980s. So please welcome Natasha, our first guest.
Hello. Whoa. Thank you all for coming. I wanted to first thank Magda and Kay for an extraordinarily open-ended invitation to think about what an experimental curatorial talk can be. It's very generous and unusual. And I also wanted to thank Kerry Downey, who is here somewhere, especially for her introduction to this term failure, which I found so productive over the course of our project together and in general, thinking about feminism and war. So thank you. Mary Walling-Blackburn, I'm just going to mention a lot of people over the course of this talk that I worked with because it's such a complicated project, so bear with us. Mary Walling-Blackburn, who couldn't join us today, sent a clip, the clip that I'm about to show you, to the working group of participants for the exhibition, Failing to Levitate, which took place in June and July of this year at the project space at Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts here in Manhattan. Before I talk about the show, I want to linger on this clip and another one that she sent to us all, because I think they work as sort of complicated visual definitions for the term failure, which is a term that, as we discovered in the course of our work together, is amorphous and can be defined in many different ways. There are myriad competing definitions for it. So to ground my discussion, I want to think through these two clips. The first one is, as you can see, 30 seconds. And I will introduce it after.
We were going to go on a crusade across the nation and try to do away with the homosexuals. And every...
Security agents, security agents.
No, let him stay.
No.
Let him stay.
Well, at least it's a fruit pie.
Huh. Let's pray for him right now. Anita, let's pray.
Father, I want to ask that you forgive him.
That we love him.
And that we love him. And that we're praying for him to be delivered from his deviant lifestyle, Father. And I just...
We know she couldn't get her hair done after that.
Okay, so the person that we saw pied is Anita Bryant, former beauty pageant queen, sort of queen, semifinalist, and then sometimes queen, pop music star and conservative Christian pundit. And we saw her on a news conference in 1977 where she is campaigning for the abolition of gay rights or against gay rights when an activist named Tom Higgins pies her. Bryant's very calm, authoritative male co-speaker decides that Higgins can stay, the activist can stay in the room, and tells Bryant to join him in a prayer for the activist. He even gives her the words. He tells her to pray for Higgins and to tell him that we love him. And I think this is the interesting moment for me. The calm one demands that Bryant immediately repress her own humiliation. Do not admit aggression, he seems to say. Smother your own negative feelings in discourse, in the Christian doctrine to love the other. Yet as we watch, Bryant's language breaks apart. It fragments in the face of her humiliation and perhaps also her anger. There is a gap, a space into which she falls between the doctrine that she fights for and her emotional reality in that moment. Her enemy, presumably a gay person, confronts her violently, and she is unable to turn the other cheek. She is unable to maintain control or to stay in language. Bryant's failure to speak the words, "and that we love him," without ambivalence, marks, for me, the limit of her capacity to love abstractly, that is to say, to love in discourse alone. One of the definitions that I gave in the curatorial statement for the show, Failing to Levitate, talked about failure as a psychoanalytic critique of self-presence, or the idea that we know always who we are or why we do things. Psychoanalysis, especially feminist psychoanalysis, has argued that, in fact, the subconscious plays an enormous role in our behavior and our investments in particular kinds of belief systems, that desire and aggression motivate us beyond rationality, and that there is always a part of ourselves that we cannot know. This clip illustrates Bryant's failure to be self-present. Rationally, she should love this man who has just attacked her on national television. She should stay in reason with her co-speaker. I think her failure to stay in reason or to be bounded by language or to be bounded by the doctrine of her faith system testifies to her incoherence as a subject, but equally to the incoherence of her religious/political position. when confronted with its object. It is the moment that these twin incoherences are articulated that I am calling failure. Another clip, which was also submitted by Mary Walling-Blackburn at the same time. So they were twins in their presentation. I'm just copying their twinness tonight. And it will introduce itself, and it's about 3.5 minutes.
And we drove 3,000 miles to play for you people. And somebody told me you people are crazy, but I'm not so sure about that. You seem to be all right with me. The way I walk is just the way I walk. The way I talk is just the way I talk. The way I smile is just the way I smile. Touch me, baby, and I go. The way I love is just the way I love. You're already the one I'm thinking of. Touch me, baby, oh, feel so good. Sometimes I think I wanna, but I don't know where my good, oh no. And I go wild. The way I love is just the way I love. You're already the one I'm thinking of. Touch me, baby, oh, feel so good. Sometimes I think I wanna, but I don't know if I should. All right. I'm moaning, I'm doing and bad, all right. Hey, let's rock it, man. Rock! Come on, it's a dance, right? Dance! Way you love has got to clear my style. Oh, little baby, I would say bye-bye. I'm moaning, I'm doing that, all right. All right.
Okay, so here we have a completely different kind of confrontation. Here the confrontation is between supposedly sane people and supposedly insane people, or supposed performers and supposed audience members, supposed free people and supposed detained people. This confrontation is much friendlier than what takes place between Higgins and Bryant, but I think the effect is very similar. Discourse is shown to be insufficient to the task of describing the thing that is taking place. In other words, discourse fails to give the viewer a clear picture of which characters belong in which discourse, sane/insane, performer/audience, etc. By discourse, I do not mean language in the pedestrian sense, language like song lyrics or English or French. I mean discourse as a narrative that mental institutions produce, the mental institution produces about itself and its inhabitants, or the narrative of rock music produces about itself and its agents, the two that we see in confrontation here, although I think that goes for most institutional constructs. The failure in the Cramps video is the inability of rock music as a narrative to differentiate its rebellious heroes from mental patients and their lack of freedom, or their detainment. Failure here, I think, is equally the inability of the mental institution as a narrative to differentiate its poorly socialized, with large quotes around it, inhabitants from those whose socialization is spectacularly successful, i.e. rock stars. This is a picture of the blur at the edges of categories society uses to hold people in place, where rock stars and mental patients resemble each other for a moment, where they share space in such a way that allows us to question their fundamental difference for a moment. The kind of failure that I am talking about, and I think is at the foundation of this show, Failing to Levitate, does not make any of these people better. Failure is not a counter-proposal to end the violence of heteropatriarchy. It will not undo or even necessarily alleviate the violence of institutions, like mental institutions that enforce neurotypical behaviors. These are only pictures of rupture and dissonance, and their value lies, I would argue, in their ability to reveal the artificiality of discourses normally assumed to be objective. This is a modest value, quiet and decidedly unheroic. The discussion about whether or not this gesture does enough in the political sense is related, I think, and very important, and I will touch on it briefly at the end of the talk. But to be very honest with you all, I am not totally sure what enough looks like. I think it's an open question. So now we have two examples of failure and some understanding of what failure is not. So on the one hand, the moment when a subject fails to be self-present, and two, the moment when institutions fail to produce stable subjects. These, I think, function as the backstory to the exhibition, in my mind at least, or pretexts, or process documents. So already there is a fold in the way exhibition making is typically understood. There is a collectively generated archive at this project's foundation, and not just one idea. Here is another fold. The exhibition as a whole is a project made by many, many, many people, a partial list of whom, in alphabetical order, include A. Pattern, which is a pseudonym, Malin Arnell, Claire Balliant, Lauren Beerley, Ethan Breckenridge, So-Hu Cho, Bill Deitz, Kerry Downey, Danielle Ferrari, Dylan Dajiv, Rachel Higgins, the U.S. Marine Helicopter Squadron HSC-5, Raphael Kelman, Elena Levy, Michelle Levy, Heather Love, Mitch McEwen, Glendalise Medina, Patricia Perkins, Jen Rosenblit, Nika Ross, Elizabeth Tibergen, Mary Walling Blackburn, and Urso H. Blackburn. So it is impossible, I think, to give an account of this project from one perspective, even my perspective as one half of the curatorial team. And I think part of that impossibility is the way that we structured both time and sociality in the exhibition. Many people from the list above met for 3-hour sessions once a month for 5 months before the show opened. Kerry is my co-curator, Kerry and I initially thought of these as a space to flesh out the project's grounding terms, which were failure and vulnerability, very broadly speaking. I think that we failed to come to any consensus about what these terms mean or how each person thinks about them in their own work. In addition to the meetings, we also had 7 events over the course of a 1-month exhibition where we collectively continued to grapple with these terms, and I think only further dispersed their meaning. And I thought that this failure on a structural level was very, very interesting. And if you want to know more, there's an enormous amount of material archived on the website. You can read excerpts from our emails to one another throughout the process. There are articles and videos besides the ones that Mary sent us. There are many, many more from other perspectives, sometimes competing perspectives on what failure could mean. There are project descriptions as well as several instances of the refusal to describe projects in any terms, which are very fascinating. Kerry's curatorial statement is there. This image is not on the screen any longer. But there it is. Oh, maybe it was never on the screen. Oh dear. There it is. This is part of Kerry's curatorial statement. There's a series of images and then a statement that describes them. And then there's also my own curatorial statement, which is very different from what I'm talking about tonight. Tonight, I want to talk, instead of sort of a panoptic view of the exhibition, I want to talk about one moment which was very brief and very intimate to explore the understanding of failure that I started to read in the clips that I showed earlier. There it is. Okay. Danielle Ferrari and Rachel Higgins collaborated on a series of objects which you see here, and they called the series Others Will Surely Follow. Rachel bolted sections of salvaged and lightly altered theater seating to rolling plinths of various heights, which were then deployed throughout the space of the exhibition and used for all of our events and several sort of informal gatherings. This seating was conceived in conjunction with a cart that Danielle designed and that she and Rachel built together. In my opinion, these works function as 2 semi-independent parts of a social sculpture. They invited other artists from within the show and the larger community to engage with either section over the course of the exhibition. And I'm going to present one reading of the moment that Nika Ross took them up on this invitation. The cart is modeled after food carts that I'm sure you all are all familiar with and that exist throughout the city, in fact, throughout the world. They're mobile kitchens often and are usually, although not exclusively, staffed by immigrants, a fact that testifies to the mobility of capitalist labor and to its precarity, I think. The cart for Others Will Surely Follow is built quickly and for a fraction of the cost of more professional food carts. It's solid, it has a welded metal frame, but I think it's also a sketch of its double. It has a provisional quality in contrast to the saturated, flashy texture of the rest of Times Square's architecture. And a provisionality, I think, that was intended to reference the provisional nature of labor that supports the sort of glowing surface of Times Square. Some of you may also have heard of WOMON, which is a monthly audiovisual event that Nika Ross co-hosts. For these evenings, she produces an original live video feed curated from a wide variety of artist materials, including porn and found footage. This is an image of one that I took off the internet. That is maybe a moment in one of these things. This is Nika in the cart. Nika did something similar with the cart from Others Will Surely Follow, a live mobile audiovisual performance in Times Square after nightfall. I will play a short video of documentation. It runs about 3 minutes, and I'm going to play it once with the sound, and then I'm going to play it once without sound while I read over it, so you have a chance to absorb the visual material twice.
Then they close at 6. It was like this.
The first two videos I showed tonight are fascinating in part because, for all my discussion about their failure, I think they worked. They were able to make a picture of rupture, of failure as rupture. But while the mobile screening in Times Square, that we just saw documentation of, worked for Nika and Danielle and Rachel and I because we were paying attention, reading the images around us deeply and with intention, it is not obvious to me, at least, that the cart's passage made a substantial philosophical impact on the people around us. I'm just saying. I watched, but I didn't see any flashes of inspiration. So what then? Why do I show it, and what's the confrontation? And why? Yeah, failing to levitate was on paper a show about social practice. So you might think that the point of the project is to show how the many, many people in Times Square at 9 and 10 o'clock on a summer night responded to a different kind of imagery and a different kind of screen. You might think that the cart is supposed to make people look at the pictures that Nika produces and suddenly understand somehow that heteronormative advertising is impoverishing them. Or maybe something slightly less dramatic than that, but nevertheless a rupture to prove that counter-narratives are effective against the onslaught that is represented by an environment like Times Square. What I observed that night in Times Square was that it's a place full of images that no one is really looking at, full of images that do not want to be looked at, that just want their brand names absorbed. People come to the square to drink in an architectural folly that has no self-reflection and therefore demands no self-reflection. People come to watch themselves in the glow of the screens, in the glow of highly produced images that reassure them that they are compensated for capitalism's madness. They do not even look at the superhero impersonators, pictures parading about as bodies. They have their boyfriends, girlfriends, coworkers on a business trip, mothers, take photographs of them with superheroes. The point is not to look, but to show their friends at home that they have stepped into the movie and that they have the documentation to prove it, to prove that they were there in the glow, in the center of a world built of pixels. The confrontation here is between the surface programmed by capital and the surface mixed on a laptop by a live person, mobile only because Danielle and Rachel pushed it around. A tiny, faint, low-resolution screen that is trying to question the given objective structure of desire in a sea of heroicism. This cart is another kind of architectural folly, then, or a wish that it could be otherwise made physical and then rolled very slowly, very arduously across a TV screen for a moment. Nika talks about the move in her own work from photographs to live projection in the context of Womon as an attempt to step out of the photograph in order to touch people, to make some impression on their bodies, to make them do something instead of just look, or in addition to just looking. She wanted the picture to speak with more force, to insist that viewers understand it phenomenologically. This demand is met, in my experience, if the viewer is prepared to look, to be moved, to be challenged, to dance. The whole phenomenon of Times Square in all its spectacularity is an engine to stop us from looking, a context produced to disarm us. The confrontation here is thus between one idea of an image and another, as well as the context that each of these images is embedded in. And I think this confrontation teaches us something about the danger of spectacularity or heroicism, about the way it abstracts images and people. They don't throw pies at people, and they don't scream/sing their refusal of social norms at other people. True. In their refusal to be violent or heroic, Danielle and Rachel and Nika fail to break the TV, granted. But I think in this failure, they suggest another way forward, another way of making images of desire, and another structure for sociality, which I think is the most important thing. Smaller, quieter, longer, deeper, more fragile, more self-reflective. Thank you.
If not, there's conversation and talk and drinks afterwards. If you want to kind of like go more into that.
I was talking about failure for like a year and a half straight, so I'm happy to keep talking about it afterwards. Just come find me.
Okay, so next is our next presentation is by Nuno da Luz. He's going to be presenting the diaporama on the subjects of synthetics, the science of research as devised by Polish engineer and inventor Joseph Tikosiner. Tikosiner envisioned a new science that would be able to discover gaps in knowledge and formulate new problems in order to foster the growth and expansion of human knowledge. Nuno is a Portuguese artist, graphic designer, and publisher based in Berlin. His work is both oral and visual in the form of sound events, installations, and printed matter, mostly distributed through the publisher Atlas Projectors and the record label Palmaria Recordings. Nuno also in 2011 published Synthetics, a taxonology of pictorial knowledge, which is a book on science of research. So, welcome, Nuno.
Thank you. I guess, yeah, this is on. So, just a minute. Yeah, thank you for having me here. And I will talk briefly about the science of research as it was developed by Josef Tico-Zinner. What you can see behind me are the closing words of the preface to his first book, called Research as a Science, Synthetics. It was published in 1959, and it was the first of a series. He published then 2 others on the topic. This is the cover of the first one. And the author, Josef Tico-Zinner, was a researcher, a scientist, an electrical engineer, an inventor. He was born in Poland in 1977. And he first left at the age of 18 to come to New York to study and work. There's a small anecdote. He's supposed to have met Nikola Tesla during that time. He managed to see the bioscope by Edison. And a few years after, he returned to Europe in 1897 to study in Germany. And right after those studies, he went on to work for Marconi at the wireless telegraph company in London. By the time that they were doing the first wireless transmission. So this is 1901, 1902. 2 years after, he went on to work for Telefunken in Berlin. And they sent him shortly after that to Russia to do the first radio communication systems, wireless radio communication systems, for the Russian fleet, just in time for the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. He stayed in Russia for a while until the October Revolution, when he fled to Poland first, and then 3 years after, he got a job in the US, in the Westinghouse Research Laboratory. A year after, Tico-Zinner was offered a position at the University of Illinois as a research professor of electrical engineering. And during his tenure, he developed research on antenna design, shortwave radio, dielectrics, piezoelectricity, photoelectric cells, and microwaves. More importantly, he was one of the first to develop an optically recorded soundtrack onto film. So what this means is that the actual sound, instead of being some other source connected with the film, has actually been recorded or printed onto it. This was in 1922, and he called it actophone. Oh, I forgot. Should be. Okay, so this invention was done at the same time that other inventors were also researching on this. So in the end, Ticotziner didn't get the patent. This was then given to a kind of earlier but contemporary version of the same thing called phonofilm, invented by Lee DeForest and Theodore Case. In both cases, basically, what was happening was the sound was being basically was modulating a light source that was imprinting onto the film through a mercury lamp that was basically modulated by by the microphone, and through a photo cell, it could then be played back in a projector. The whole idea behind what Ticotziner wanted to achieve was actually to answer a question he posed himself, if we could actually photograph sound. He did a lot of other research in between, but basically what brings us here is what he did after he retired in 1949. He dedicated himself to what he called the science of research, or zethetics, which is, in this case, kind of a neologism. It's been used throughout centuries, but he decided to give his own interpretation. Basically, we can find, for example, in this case, that a zetetic would mean to proceed by inquiry, and that its origin comes from the Greek zetetikos, and from the noun zetein, which means to seek. It was also used by a certain group of Pyrrhonist philosophers, so followers of Pyrrho, called the skeptics, or seekers. So the origin between zethetics and skeptics, or scepticism, is the same. It was also used later on by a French mathematician called François Viette, that in the end of the 14th century provided algebra with a symbolic analysis. He called this zetetic, so the art of translating a problem into an equation by means of using symbols. In this case, we all know these days A, B, C, or X, Y, Z as given quantities, or in this case, unknown quantities. He used then vowels for the unknown ones and consonants for the known. For Ticotziner, he was mainly interested in the Greek root zeteo, which means to seek, and he thought he could summarize best what he hoped would develop into his comprehensive area of knowledge and bring together various aspects of research and how this affects the growth of human culture. He writes, "It is the object of this treatise to outline research in general as such a science, called zethetics, and to report on the immediate tasks which have been undertaken as steps towards its further development. Its aim is rather to collect and systematize all the information we possess about research activities, including the creative processes, with the view to extending that knowledge which leads to discoveries, inventions, and the solution of human problems." He continues, "It includes as its basic factual material all the available data concerning the origin of discoveries, inventions, works of art, and great systems of philosophy. And it is concerned with improving methods of inquiry, especially by expanding scientific methods, discovering gaps in knowledge, and formulating new problems." For Ticotziner, the tendency toward increasing specialization is opposed to what he thought was the general trend of development. He advocates mostly for a development that's made possible by a widening of interests, so from the specific, narrow tasks to problems that require ever-expanding perspectives. And he feels that that is increasingly the case, especially at the time that he was writing. This is from 59 to 67. And he felt that it became necessary for individual researchers to join forces in attacking the problems which are growing in number and mounting in complexity. So a group of researchers would be made up of a diversity of talents and possess a variety of experience that would be more effective and accelerate the production of new knowledge. Although, in a way, maybe it's a bit simplistic, But he implicitly makes a case, at least in my perspective, for a certain type of non-linear thinking and for some kind of interdisciplinarity, although he never used the term. I guess these would be then the motors for what he calls zetesis, again, a neologism with the same root in the Greek zeteo, that would stand for both research in science as well as artistic activities. This would be the diagram for the dynamic of knowledge. And we have here the product of zetesis, which is this shaded triangle, both research and artistic activities. And this is the increment of knowledge which flows into the common store, pictured above. In the store of knowledge, we possess a treasure which is not depleted by use, but rather increased by it. The diagram shows the process of growth and amplification of knowledge due to research and artistic activities. Or in other words, the knowledge of science is equal to the sum of all recorded systematized knowledge between a moment t0 in time and another moment t1 in time, where the Greek letter sigma would then both be the sum operator and the first letter of the word science. So inside the knowledge of science, K of S, we would have a myriad of different Ks, in this case knowledge from different disciplines. This would give rise to not only the sum of all the knowledge that we already systematized, but also through an expansion that would consist of applying zetesis to each one of those fields, in this case denoted by the Greek letter delta, or again the shaded triangle, and not only incorporate those, but also together what would come out of that further knowledge, which would be the new arts and sciences, so the delta knowledge of N, and also through the basic fact of researching. Research itself would be further developed into delta K of zetetics. This would all be integrated into one whole, which would then be called integrated knowledge, in this case between a moment in time 1 and a moment in time 2, denoted by the integral symbol, which would then be the first letter of the word science. Tikatsuna writes that the total growth of knowledge cannot be represented merely by summing up all the particular delta Ks, which included also zetics, but something else should be considered, which he then calls the growth by unification of sciences. Referring to this equation, what he means by this, and you can also read it, would be that integration of science would lead then to a consistent knowledge of ways of life, appropriate to develop and sustain a creative human society, an all-encompassing synthesis. Going back to the second part of our equation, in this case, number 3, we have the spiral as the symbol of both research and artistic activity. This would mean to explore, to speculate, to innovate, to invent, to discover. In his words, this movement, this upward spiraling movement, would be zetesis, a purposeful activity aiming at the extension of the field of knowledge and experience by discovering new facts, formulating generalized relations, and inventing mental and material devices for complementing human abilities. And still paraphrasing the author, zetesis is the activity that converts the unknown into the known. It can be expressed as the activity which transforms our present state of knowledge into a more precise, more expanded, and more unified one. By analogy and the use of biological terms, zetesis may be looked upon as a process whereby knowledge and experience are made to grow into an ever-developing, organically interrelated system. In a wider sense, this process is also instrumental in creating works of art. For Tico Sinner, the process of zetesis would never cease. Exploration and observation would give rise to experiments whose results would then be interpreted and make way for new problems, new parameters, and new predictions. This would further fuel the cyclical movement symbolized in the spiraling upwards of knowledge. So, for such a task, Tico Sinner defends that the classical figure of the researcher, at least as it would have been in the 50s and the 60s in the US, would have to change necessarily. He writes that we must educate a new imaginative explorer, capable of building structures of knowledge out of the materials supplied by various specialized researchers. The rapidly developed new world could use a great many such architects of knowledge, or zetetists, complicated term. These zetetists would have to learn how to combine knowledge derived from large groups of arts and sciences and mold it into unified structures that would be functionally suitable, aesthetically valuable, and ethically appropriate for a higher level of living. So in my opinion, I cannot help but wonder, what does an engineer that was so far more dedicated to wireless communications research and electrotechnics, why does he draw out what we can consider then maybe a particularly accurate portrait of cognitive and intellectual workers, at least as we know and are part of that today? So if the place and activities of art, especially, since that's my field, I feel that today they fall into the broad categorization that I just described. And it's not without appreciation for what was achieved in the field of scientific research prior and immediately after the Second World War. But Tico Sinner hardly mentions anything of what was happening in the world at that time, except for some references to mutual nuclear annihilation. And so it's not clear if he was aware of any major shifts in social and in society in general. I do feel that still we could make a case for what has ensued in the artistic fields and in social sciences departments all over the Western world. Let's say that these transformations in paradigms and conventional social roles as personified, mostly by artists, intellectuals, and researchers, and also the confusion played out by reacting against academia or by treading new paths for racial, gender, and social roles. In my understanding, this is somewhat implied when Tico Sinner mentions the imaginative exploration, or in this case, the word architects of knowledge. I cannot help but feel that it's inextricably bound to today's artists and researchers. But in order to understand the rest of his theory, we should move forward to the next chapter, which is called Toxicology. In it, Tico Sinner tried to understand and to collect as a whole all the available names of arts and sciences and arrange them into a consistent system, the all-embracing synthesis that we were talking previously. This would be the systematization of all human knowledge. In his words, toxicology would be, or it would supply and maintain an inventory of all the arts and sciences. It would develop a zetetic system of knowledge to facilitate orientation in research and education. And this would be the zetetic system. This would suggest to an inquiring mind new relations between various parts of knowledge and enable us to search for new branches, both of arts and sciences. By navigating this system, we could find 12 different areas divided into 5 concentric rings. So starting from within, we would have already integrated knowledge in the ring 5 or circle 5. Ring 4 would then have all the systematized different areas of knowledge that will enable us to proceed onto ring 3 that, as he calls them, is yet unsystematized knowledge. Region 2 would then be what he calls the knowables, which are not yet known, and further on into area 1, which has no ring of itself. This would be the unknown. Going back into this, and all of the areas are explained here, he tried to come up with a systematization that brings a lot of terms that are not so simple. We can start from clockwise. The first area would be the arts. Area 2 would be symbolics of information. This would comprehend linguistics, logic, mathematics. Area 3 would be high energetics, all sciences that embrace matter and energy. Area 4, biological area. Area 5, psychological. Area 6, sociological. Area 7, exeligmology, which would both take evolution and history. Area 8, chronoethics, all sciences related to sustaining life, agriculture, medicine, and technology. Area 9, the regulative, which would basically be political science, economics, law. Area 10, disseminative area, with education, pedagogy, library science, journalism. Area 11 would be zoetetics, all of its own, so research completely separated from the other areas. And Area 12, the integrative area, which would basically try to put together all of this. He finds a lot less, let's call them disciplines, inside this area than in the other ones. He feels that in this area, what we would achieve is all of the knowledge from each one of the areas through zoetetics would then give rise to this one, which then would make, or it would enable region 5 to grow. So he had to invent a few words for all of this. He also tried to come up with what he called then disciplines in between. Like, again, the term interdisciplinary was never used. And for example, we have homologic symbolics, or the science of prognostics, the science of specifics that he tried to think of as important as technological research in defense was in the US at that time, that maybe research could be done in the direction of achieving peace. He then tried to come up with a system of notation that would be basically, or it would enable library cataloging and also to use computer-aided methods to search for gaps in knowledge. This notation system here on the screen would give alphanumeric symbols to each one of the areas or disciplines inside that area, and so on. He decides to call to each one of these parts areas, basics, cognates, domains, enclosures, and so on. On the left-hand side, we have what could be already, what is already recorded knowledge. And here on the right-hand side, we have both what has been recorded and the potential of things that could still be discovered. So this would go as if area 2 would have several sciences within, each one of them would be listed then as area 2B and so forth. So for example, if area 1 contributes 1 basic 2, and area 2 contributes 1 basic 1, plus 1 cognate 2, plus 1 discipline 1, and area 3 contributes 1 basic 2 and 1 cognate 3, this would be the notation. Or it would also look like this. So since publishing his second book in 1966, Outline of Zethetics, and until his death in 1969, Tikhotiner tried to develop further this notation system so that it could actually be used for libraries and in computer-aided retrieval. And in 1967, a tentative publication called A Descriptive Inventory of the Arts and Sciences was put forth as a work in progress, attempting at describing extensively each area, and also their respective sciences, branches, disciplines, and so on. And with this idea in mind, he wanted to find and close gaps in knowledge. And so Tikhotiner proposed to use these lists and inventories, what he called a combinatorial of dynamic and potential knowledge, CDP, and each of the combinations included in these lists would then be expressed by this notation I showed earlier and placed together in tables, which would then be computed in order to inspect already known combinations and revealing the missing ones. This is how we felt that this amplification of knowledge would happen, basically by expanding what he already came up with as the zetetic system of knowledge up as one, and through all the difficult process of combining all of these lists and trying to come up with the basic gaps in between non-existing notation. This book, The Descriptive Inventory of the Arts and Sciences, looks a bit like this. This goes on for quite a few pages. And he had the list of around 1,600 sciences or disciplines, of which I decided to only use 3 areas of his zetetic system of knowledge. Otherwise, we would be here all night. I feel that whatever potential there was in the idea that there is something common to any kind of human endeavor, be it so-called scientific research or research in the arts or any kind of creative activity, the system starts failing when it goes into the problems of cataloging and how to record and systematize such depth of material. And I still believe that there are a few things that he was very accurate about, but for me it's quite striking that he ended up in the last few remaining years of his life to only do this. So that's it.
Want to change? Okay, so our last artist is Tyler Coburn. So last spring, artist and writer Tyler Coburn received an unusual invitation to write a press release for an exhibition that didn't exist. The following August, the exhibition will appear at Where, which is a shipping container in Bushwick, run by artist Raphael Lyon and art historian Lucy Hunter. This project space is primarily accessible by means of a surveillance feed. Coburn, like the general public, will have to trust its veracity. Coburn's press release imagines an interpassive exhibition, both in structure and content. This term, popularized by Slavoj Žižek, designates those moments when we allow ourselves to feel and believe through the big other. The love track loves, the media mourns on our behalf, and so on. Far from just trading away our agency, however, interpassivity entails a radical decentering of the self. We may even come to return obligations and injunctions, for example, which we should never have been made to keep. Tyler is an artist and writer based in New York. This fall, Coburn will participate in the Shanghai Biennial created by Anselm Franke, as well as the exhibitions at the Hayward Gallery in London, Art Space in Auckland, Impact Festival in Utrecht, and S1 Art Space in Sheffield, and others. So, welcome, Tyler.
Thanks. How's the volume? Can everybody hear me? Yep. Okay. Thank you, Magda. Thank you, Kay. Thank you, Natasha and Nuno. And thank you all for being here this evening. So, I'm going to set the timer, so. Okay, so my talk is about this man and his theory of interpassivity. It's also about these people who invited me to write a press release for an exhibition that didn't exist. How we get from one to the other is the matter at hand, and I thank you in advance for bearing with me. It's a bumpy ride, but I promise lots of good news. So 4 years ago, I came across this amazing image of the psychoanalyst Slavoj Žižek, looking like a horny seal on Freud's couch. The painting, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is Courbet's Origin of the World, and Jacques Lacan owned the painting for a period of time. So a discussion of the what the fuckness of this image would fill a whole other evening, so I'll spare you my analysis. But in any event, back in 2010, I was a cathexis junkie. Žižek had the good stuff, and I got hooked on his theory of interpassivity. Now, interpassivity is easiest to understand in distinction from interactivity. In his writing on the topic from the mid-2000s, Žižek is thinking particularly about how interactivity is associated with networked life, about the popular belief that through online media, we no longer passively consume, but are delivered again as prosumers. His participatory turn, of course, figures into the liberal democratic horizon of the internet. And this horizon, as we well know, is all too often defined and practiced by corporate fiefdoms. We can be our most interactive, participatory, democratic selves. We just need to join Facebook first. As the uncanny double of interactivity, interpassivity denotes situations in which we give away our passivity, in which our passive experience is transferred to and performed through the other. This is a crucial point, so let me clarify. We're not passively consuming a sitcom, for example. Rather, we are witness to the laugh track performing the passive consumption on our behalf. Whether we, in turn, also laugh is irrelevant to the scenario. By giving away our passivity, we have freed ourselves to enjoy as we like. Moreover, Žižek claims that what we feel at the end of viewing is a similar satisfaction to what we would have felt if we laughed the whole way through. That in a strange way, we may give away our passive consumption of an object, but can reap the same affective rewards. Here are some examples the theorist cites. The Greek chorist that can perform our innermost feelings and attitudes. The professional mourners hired to do the weeping at a funeral. This image accompanied a 2010 news report about the surge of help wanted ads for weepers in Iran. The Tibetan prayer wheel, its cylinder containing a paper roll of Buddhist texts. A believer need only set the wheel in motion, and it will supposedly do the praying on his or her behalf. Christ himself, who redeemed us not by acting for us, but by assuming the burden of the ultimate passive experience. The fundamentalist or spiritualist other, through whom the rest of us can act out our ideological fantasies. The relational structure here is such that to maintain a sense of rational superiority over the other, we must measure our exodus from belief by means of their remaining. We are dependent, in other words, upon their continuing belief while disavowing any stake in the matter. The other can thus continue to believe on its behalf and interpassively believe on ours. The Coke can that proclaims, "Ooh, what taste," pleasuring itself autophagically. I couldn't find an image to demonstrate. Zizek talks about this one at length, but the example is too good to ignore. What Zizek would write about this more recent line of Coke bottles is tantalizing to imagine. It seems like sharing a Coke has become a form of symbolic cannibalism by mutually consenting cannibals. On that note, here's a quick selfie of me and strangers, and here's a photo of some of you. Now, I realize that these are wildly different types of examples, suggesting the reach of interpassive experience. Certainly, we can recognize the structure of most advertising to follow from the Coke example. For what do we usually see, if not people and commodities, anticipating our enjoyment, enjoying better than we ever could, taking the enjoyment out of enjoyment, freeing us from the injunction to enjoy? Beyond advertising, the reach of interpassive experience may suggest, as Zizek writes, that the fundamental attitude which defines the subject is neither that of passivity nor that of autonomous activity, but precisely that of interpassivity. Before we can begin to unpack that seismic claim, let's refine our working definition. Here's the basic distinction Zizek gives for the two dominant modes of interpassive experience. 1, the laugh track, the mourners, the prayer wheel. The mistake we make in these cases is in assuming our enjoyment is passive, not interpassive. To Zizek, this is a mistake of humanist thinking, a belief that we begin as self-present subjectivities who then choose passive or active ways of experiencing the world. But when we follow his line of thinking and recognize interpassivity as a fundamental attitude, a displacement of one's experience, then we are no longer centered subjects choosing to be decentered, but subjects negotiating a pre-existing field constituted without a center. These forms of experience Zizek puts in the realm of real belief. 2, the savior, the fundamentalists. As I mentioned before, the interpassive move here relies on disavowing the identity of one's own belief, while interpassively believing through the other. This Zizek calls symbolic belief. The object believes for you, the object suffers for you. Let's return to the provocative claim that interpassivity is the fundamental attitude that defines the subject. The assumption here is that the necessary minimum of subjectivity, that inert, passive kernel of self, our pleasures, beliefs, those most intimate guilts, the very wax reserved for society's stamp, can be cast off, delegated, performed through the other. What becomes of this subjective kernel that we trade on the interpassive exchange? It begins as the unconscious, it remains the other. And what do we gain in the trade? A thin shell and a wide blank, running room in the drive to act. We begin again as a void, as an emptiness that is not nothing. So let's consider the possibilities afforded by this state. Certainly we have disabused ourselves of the myth of the possessive individual, but how can we imagine an active, critical life for a human born in the wide blank? In his 2010 essay, The Subject Supposed to Recycle, Campbell-Jones gives a practical example. Recycling, in his opinion, has become a seemingly moral duty, and yet who are the agents of this moral responsibility? How have the workings of ideology supposed us recycling subjects? Obviously, Jones is not arguing against the ecological benefits of recycling. Rather, he worries that the moralization of recycling aids rather than alleviates capitalist overconsumption, providing a small offset for consumer guilt when systemic work is needed. The simple fact that recycling has been naturalized as a moral good, in other words, excuses consideration of whether it is merely the good most in the service of the economic status quo, instead of being the good best suited to the stark environmental challenges ahead. We need then to denaturalize recycling, to depersonalize duty, to remove the vast body of consumers from the center stage of guilt. In Jones's argument, interpassivity is the motor, a refusal of the duties we should never have been made to follow. The refusal to perform, of course, is also a deliberate failure to perform, which Jones sees as a means of demanding renewed accountability from the other. Finally, the other is compelled to step into the light, become the agent of its actions, and assume responsibility, albeit a responsibility twice refracted from blank to shell. Let's move on to another case study. As I previously mentioned, Zizek assumes that interactivity increases in the online age. This merits revision with the rise of algorithmic tracking. Social media may provide ground for interpersonal interaction, but its intended value, its remunerative value, is ultimately reliant upon our passive consent. We accept the terms that allow us to communicate some version of ourselves, but far more than becoming virtual subjects, we become objects tracked by objects. Lucrative objects, to be precise, surrounded by commercial objects. Now, there's been much talk about how to game the algorithm, and I'll briefly discuss one theory. Earlier this year, Rob Horning, this is him, made the provocative call for a post-authentic self. By giving away those parts of ourselves transferable into value-rich data, by shamelessly and disingenuously performing for algorithmic capture, we may come to identify that non-transferable remainder of selfhood, also known as the soul. Put that word in scare quotes, and it doesn't seem so quaint. Horning's theory is helpful in recognizing the entailment of interactivity and interpassivity in Web 2.0 experience. We are, in a sense, both the joke and the laugh track, product and consumer, the hand that feeds and the ass that shits. Like Zizek, he recognizes that we can only regain a sense of interiority by negative means. He's hoping that a soul may be hiding in the hollows. Zizek, as we have seen, contends that this kernel was the first thing we traded away, but that the resulting space can still be put to use. Inevitably, art elbows in, and the possible applications of interpassivity to the field. Certainly, we recognize the structure of much commercial art to go the way of the Coke ad. For what do we usually see, if not commodities anticipating our enjoyment, enjoying better than we ever could, taking the enjoyment out of enjoyment, freeing us from the injunction to enjoy? The Coke bottle shrieks, "Ooh, what taste!" The artwork says the same thing, albeit in a different tone. Think ejaculate on ice. So what then would be a critical form of interpassivity? Is the interpassive artist a post-authenticist, circulationist, all-purposes slut? True, there may be an overproducer out there mining the inessential crap to uncover his soul. There may be a silver factory for the post-Fordist worker wrapped around soul substitute. Claire Fontaine's theory of the ready-made artist is helpful here. Under the present conditions of cultural production, she claims, we are all ready-made artists, expropriated from life, from the use of life, and thus from the experience of freedom. We are as absurd and displaced and as vulgar as Duchamp's urinal. And like the urinal, our aesthetic value depends on our inutility, on our having no influence over the cultural apparatus and even less over its political function. Instead, we are left to carry on the conventional roles of the artist. Even the relational aestheticians, Fontaine claims, are burdened by the pretense of originality. To proceed, she tells us, we must first recognize our situation as quickly as possible. In this, Fontaine echoes Jones's writing on recycling. What follows, however, is a question. Fontaine herself has dealt with the ready-made artist's impotence by making political impotence the means and subject of her work. If the failure of 20th century political movements make them into aesthetic objects, her argument goes, then art possesses a databank of potential uprisings. By self-identifying as a ready-made artist, Fontaine justifies her continuing participation in the conventional art field while introducing works that, in aspiration, are not wholly co-optable by its logics. This we may call an interpassive strategy. Fontaine lets her ready-made alias submit to the conventions of the art world machine, while she herself hones her political agenda. Her balancing act may be more successful in theory than practice, but for our purposes it's worth considering. This brings us to the main event. What you're looking at, supposedly, is Where, a shipping container in Bushwick run as a project space by artist Raphael Lyon and art historian Lucy Hunter. I say supposedly because I've never been there, and I'm not sure that it even exists. The container's main form of access is a surveillance feed, but more on that later. Last spring, Raphael and Lucy approached me, setting in motion a series of events that led to me talking here tonight, to you listening here tonight. I was invited to write a press release, or to be precise, I was invited to imagine an exhibition for which a press release would be written. The organizers, in turn, would realize it. Now, I was once a prop in a similar endeavor. A London entity known as Nuden Da has written a press release to be used as a prompt for exhibition making. its text is less a description of a potential show than a reflection on the function of the press release and on interpretive text within the gallery. A handful of exhibitions ensued, with curators having free range in their execution. Vincent Onore, for example, decided to curate an iteration in 2011 at Monitor Gallery in Rome, but then deemed the project failed, given that he had flouted the given terms, changing the press release copy and even including the writers as artists in the show. Far from reduced curators to handmaidens, Ab Nudendah's press release became a site of contestation. Anyways, what you're looking at here is the first iteration of the project from 2010 at Form Content in London. On that little monitor is an old performance of mine about Peggy Guggenheim, staged on a replica of one of the Kiesler rockers she commissioned for her Art of the Century gallery. Here I am in my most embarrassing position, ready to take every inch of the ghost. And here is Peggy on her throne of dogs. You can play out the rest. Back to the present. Suffice it to say that I was not planning to replicate the good thing Ab Nudendah has going. Interpassivity had been on my mind for years, and the prompt from Lucy and Raphael to conceive an exhibition that they would produce was conducive to unpacking the term. Now, I wouldn't call my press release failed per se. It exists, and sometime soon, an exhibition or a response from Lucy and Raphael will manifest. But I wrote it last spring, and with every month I care for it less. Sure, it serves a function like the spark of an engine, necessary but momentary, less meaningful in itself than in what it points to. In this sense, it's not very different from any press release. With that said, I'll give you a quick tour of my notional exhibition without much commentary. The following are research images for intended artworks, each engaging interpassivity in a topical way. In Bruno Scholz's Street of Crocodiles, the protagonist's father shares the devastating account of how his own brother, as a result of a long and incurable illness, has been gradually transformed into a bundle of rubber tubing, and that his poor cousin had to carry him day and night on his cushion, singing endless lullabies to the luckless creature. Can there be anything sadder, he wonders, than a human being being changed into the rubber tube of an enema? This outfit is called a drunkard's cloak, which I first learned about from artist Sophie Nice. In the 16th and 17th centuries, drunkenness was criminalized in several European countries, including England, the Netherlands, and Denmark. This cloak was a popular punishment. One of Bruno Bettelheim's most famous patients was an autistic child named Joey, who he called a mechanical boy. Joey made a number of drawings of the various machines that powered him, from the car that drove him during sleep to the blinderator that ran him by remote control while preventing him from seeing or understanding. Loosen the oil seal, and Joey will be totally disemboweled. I could continue, but here's the thing. As I put this talk together, I came to realize that Raphael and Lucy's container is a far more interesting model of cultural interpassivity than any object I could dredge out of literature or history. So for the remainder of my time, I'd like to share some of my thinking on it. Where is the name of the space, and also a question pertinent to it? The container is a notional shell, where the surveillance camera comes first and the artwork second, where the public is a semi-public, a digital, bloodless, screenic public, where the reality of the space, its whereabouts, its very existence, are suspicious and, for the sake of good storytelling, better left unknown. I'm showing you as much as I've seen, so I'll describe it as you see it. Here is Apple's spinning wheel of death, currently on view via Ware's website. It may be a craft table rotor installed on a pedestal, or the retributive justice of this computer for being made complicit in this talk. Here's something else. Hitchcock's Psycho, as reconceived by A.E. Benenson, streaming from the container's camera at 2 frames per second to make a roundabout bootleg of Douglas Gordon's 24-hour Psycho. The film, in other words, is playing at its usual speed, a lonely show for a shipping show. The site of the art is in the transmission, the vector, the slow camera feed. The art imagines a digital screenic public, and we, bloodless and dime-eyed, lean into the role. This is beyond the pale of online art viewing. We may prefer to see our exhibitions fluoresced in Photoshop finish rather than take the flight, the train, or the walk to their galleries, but we draw comfort from the knowledge that they could be seen, and guilt when that window necessarily passes. Now, the artworks I'm showing you are difficult to access, taciturn. They don't need your presence, they just need your verification. In this interpassive contract, we agree to perform the bare minimum required of an art audience, staring from the comfort of our screens, and it consents to provide the bare minimum for an art space in a globalized, wired era. In short, digital evidence. We watch the relay of art on the wires, watch a new logistics corridor under operation, from performance audience mirror to container internet public. By the time it reaches us, most of the work has already been done on our behalf. What we do with the rest of our time is ours to decide. Is this a cynical endgame for art viewing or an earnest step towards making within a new aesthetic relay? If I had the answer, I wouldn't be up here muddling through. Interpassivity, as Zizek noted, is an attitude, not a thing. As an orientation to the world, it can and must be mobile if it can respond to the dynamics of ideology. Understanding what is supposed of us is essential for knowing how to confound expectations. I wonder how where will remain mobile, how the question cited in its very name will inform its orientation to the art world at large. I wonder what duties a small nonprofit art space is implicitly made to perform, and what modes of refusal can be made legible to its public. Sometime in the future, we'll receive a response to my press release, and perhaps that will be the first step to the answer. Thank you.
Okay, so that's it. 5 nights are over. Thank you again to everyone coming, and also our guests, and also the guests from the last 4 nights. I hope you had as much fun as we did, and if so, come by September 5th for our next show, which is We the Outsiders, created by Chus Martinez, with Eduardo Navarro, Agnieszka Brzeżańska, Federico Manuel Peralta Ramon, and Luz Momat. So enjoy, and I hope we have a great rest of the night.